So what they told me is like, okay, sorry, we could not join the conversation, but we would like to invite you as one of the experts in the development of the plan. And I said, fine, only if you invite the communities who are protesting. So we are packed right now. And Sebastian, I don't know how he managed. He said, yes, okay, let's do that. So since from that moment onwards, the negotiation table that we...
Woo, stop the rain!
The AI race is far from being over. Truth is, we're only at the beginning.
In this very first episode, I'm very glad to be joined by Marina Otero Verzier, who is an architect and researcher working at the intersection of ecology, technology, critical spatial practices, and activism, with a focus on data infrastructures. She's currently a lecturer in architecture at Harvard GSD, and her connection to the Netherlands extends to the Design Academy in Eindhoven, where she was head of the MA Social Design, and also at Nieuwe Institute, where Marina worked as a director of research. Having co-directed 5 films showcased at major international venues and festivals, Marina also works across design, art, and filmmaking, and her work presents an important critical lens on how data centers shape and are also shaped by forms of activism and resistance. Her recent works, such as the computational compost prototype, address the environmental impact of data storage. And her last publication in Spanish, called Deep Within the Cloud, explores architectures for data storage and sovereignty in the age of AI. Welcome to the podcast, Marina. It is a pleasure to start the series with you as our very first special guest.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. And thank you for your very generous introduction.
In our virtual studio, there is also Christian Van Veen, a Leitmotif's researcher and co-founder with background in human rights law. Thanks to his rich law background in the Netherlands, Leitmotif recently formed an alliance for strategic litigation against planned hyperscale data center in Amsterdam, and he simultaneously works with various activist groups in the Netherlands. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks for that nice introduction, Susanna. And I think we're very lucky with Marina as the first guest on our podcast series.
Indeed. And together we will unpack case studies on recent data center activism initiatives in Chile and Spain. We will draw parallels and differences specific to regulation contexts, talk about Marina's complex role in helping the Ministry of Science with Chile's first national data centers plan, as well as supporting local communities and activist groups, often at the same time. I'll start with you, Marina. I know some of your earlier work looked at how digital economies reshape labor and space, such as its architecture. And could you maybe take us back to how you first started looking at data centers from a political or spatial perspective?
Yes, it was around 2015-16 when I was a director of research at New Institute. And the institution is dependent on the government, the Dutch government, but also it caters to the future of the professions, both architecture design and digital culture, and the general public. So our aim as a research department was to investigate those transformations that will actually have a huge impact, both in society and the built environment. And we thought that automation was such a transformation, and the Netherlands was indeed one of the places where these transformations were taking pace on highest velocity. So to name the harbor, the dairy farms, greenhouses, and many other places. So we ran a comparative study between the Netherlands and the Pearl River Delta around Shenzhen and Hong Kong. And while we were doing research on these infrastructures and seeing how they were shifting labor conditions and also transforming the entire built environment, even the socio-political profile of cities like Rotterdam, from a more port city to perhaps more towards service economy, and what that means for the city itself, for the population, how that triggers certain forms of displacement. We were interested in following somehow the pipes, like how this infrastructure is made possible, and following the pipes coming from those places, let's say the tubes, the cables, Obviously, we went to all the cable infrastructure, makes connections possible, and the transfer of data, but also data centers where all this information is processed, and all the infrastructure of extraction that allows for making the components of most of this equipment. So that's why out of that research that we name automated landscapes, two other projects emerged that have been actually my focus for the last 10 years. One is around data centers, and the other is around lithium extraction.
Strikes me that if you've looked, for instance, at the city of Rotterdam, data centers, that in a way you're looking at sort of like a shift in the global economy from, for instance, ports being these central nodes in the international economic system to increasingly data centers becoming these points in the map and the cables that connect them as central points in the international global system, right?
Yeah, indeed. And also the Dutch government was worried with all the efforts by China to actually control infrastructure, and perhaps the port of Rotterdam, if new routes were open, will not be so important in the supply chain. And there were other infrastructures emerging at the same time, like data centers. And Amsterdam and that region of the Netherlands has had a long history connected to the development of digital technologies. So it was just part of this trajectory and these different ideas of the future and the position of the Netherlands within the world in terms of infrastructure, and that, these type of investments started to be very prominent, especially in the north, but also, in many other places, as you well know.
How was it moving from the Dutch data center landscape towards Chile?
Um, the Dutch data center landscape is very particular, and there were two moments that were quite revealing. One, the Dutch Data Center Association is quite active and very open. So we were able to actually visit many data centers and have a lot of conversations, many of them public, with the president or director of the Data Center Owner Association. That was very productive and showed that you can have conversations with this industry. Obviously, at the beginning, as an architect, when I was approaching and saying, how do you think architects could participate in this transformation? The response was mostly to design a nice facade. There was no this understanding that will be a much more strategic design in which other professionals will be involved. I don't think that's the case right now, but it was very helpful to have these conversations early on. At the same time, the Dutch society knows how to, protest and take it to the, to raise their voices when it's needed. And there was all protests connected to certain developments, this metadata center. And it was very quickly scaled up from the level of the local level to the regional level to the parliament. So it was also very inspiring to see that citizen action, local politics could have an effect in national politics around data centers. So these two were actually fundamental to understand, you can have a conversation with the industry. And at the same time, you can also protest if the conversation with the industry is not productive. And perhaps there are politicians who are willing to listen. And looking for other cases like that, Chile emerged as another place where there were protests ongoing, led by local communities, also worried about how the workings of data centers will affect the local resources. And at the same time, there was, a much more open conversation with local representatives, at least, and even the government, to discuss the possible future of the industry. So in that sense, despite the many differences between the Netherlands and Chile, there were some grounds that allowed an imagination around, this perhaps could be done otherwise. And perhaps we have some tools and forms of intervention that could transform the way the industry is being developed right now.
I'm also very keen, and this draws it more into the personal, but how you ended up working in Chile on data centers, data center resistance, data center policy making. How did that come about?
So part of the work that I conducted at the new institute around lithium was first focused on Atacama in Chile. So we organized an exhibition and a publication developed with many partners in Chile and with the editorial ARQ. So that was already an ongoing conversation and collaboration with parties in Chile and in the Netherlands. When it happened, just to be honest, it's also about love. There's always a love story in the background. So I have a Chilean partner, and that also helped to grow my interest in that region. So just to be fair. But at the same time, I got this award from Harvard University to conduct research worldwide. And that was the moment when I stopped working at the new institute and also the design academy. And I decided to develop most of my work in conducting this field work to try to, get to know communities like those in the Netherlands who were protesting for data centers, and also developments in the industry that will leading towards more eco-social data centers, if that's possible at all. So Chile indeed was since the beginning one of the places that I thought was very relevant node. First of all, because there were many investments in data center infrastructure. Second, because it had different industries connected to data industries, including lithium extraction, but also a large network and very important network of astronomical observatories and other infrastructures that generate huge amount of data and therefore need also to develop very sophisticated methods for data storage management, etc. And there was new projects for cable landing points that will connect Chile with other regions in the Pacific and connect, like creating a really like Chile as a hub in digital infrastructures. So that was the moment that I planned to go to Chile and spend time and visit all these infrastructures, not only data centers, but also supercomputers, astronomical observatories, mines, all the components that will make possible to develop data center investment. And while I was there, I was collaborating with Nicolás Díaz, who is a PhD candidate at the Universidad Católica de Chile. And I always tried to collaborate with local researchers in developing my work. And with Nicolás was incredible. We traveled together and we managed to meet with representatives of two communities, well, in fact, three, Colina, Cerrillos, and Quilicura, that were protesting data centers. So we gathered with them and we exchanged ideas, strategies, and they haven't met each other, funny enough. So it was also beautiful to see how different representatives of these movements met for the first time and, shared what are their ideas, what are their aims, what are strategies. And in that context, we asked Nicolás and I, well, okay, how can we be with you? How can our work be of any relevance for you? How can we, contribute? And Rodrigo Vallejos, who is one of the representatives of Resistencia Ambiental Quilicura, said, well, you can negotiate. You can help us negotiate. Because there were different strategies. Some of the people from Cerrillos has taken Google to court. And I can explain you on how that was possible, what was the difference between Quilicura. Rodrigo from Quilicura didn't have the possibility right now to take them to court for different reasons. So he was more interested, and his colleagues, in negotiating some terms and conditions on how data centers should operate in that region. And for that reason, he thought that me having a Harvard account could help get into contact with both the government and companies, which is very instrumental, but sometimes you need to be instrumental. So I appreciated the directness of Rodrigo. And I also loved his enthusiasm, passion. It was very inspiring to have a conversation with all of them. So I said, okay, I never done such a thing, but I trust you, and we can try to see if we can get on the same table representatives of these companies and the government. So that was what we agreed.
I'm wondering, Marina, and it's very interesting to hear about how you got drawn into this and how sort of your mixed background as an architect, as someone with experience already on data centers, but also someone with a background at a prestigious university made a difference in this context. I'm wondering for the people that are listening to the podcast, if you can give a little bit of context of how those three movements came about. What were they concerned about primarily? And also to situate us a little bit, because as I understand, these were three different data center developments in the city of Santiago de Chile, right? The capital of Chile.
Yeah, so all them are in Santiago. Mostly are movements in the outskirts of Santiago. Let's say that the one that got international attention more quickly was Cerrillos. And the reason was it was a Google data center plan for that particular region. And the citizens were able to see in the environmental assessment report that Google, in its operations, will use most of the water of the local aquifer. That was possible because at that time, Google indeed published an environmental impact report that was not that common anymore, at least not to make it to the public. So they could actually take those numbers that were coming from Google, nothing else, and said, well, if we calculate this means that the amount of water that will be used for the running, to cooling the servers in this particular data center will bring drought to this particular region. So they took it to court and eventually they won. So that forced Google to have to change the plans for the data centers and propose a new climatization system for the server rooms. This was huge because we could see, okay, some citizens were able to take Google accountable. And that was a massive revelation because many times we are under the impression that these companies are just too big and too powerful. Governments don't have anything to do on their own, even less citizens. And this was very inspiring. And it was not an easy process. I personally know Tania, who is one of the representatives of this movement, an incredible person, but everyone involved really did an incredible work. That was fundamental to trigger more similar movements around the world. So in that context, Quilicura, for instance, is a bit different. Quilicura, also in the outskirts of Santiago, is the home of a wetland ecosystem. There are many industries in Quilicura, a beer company and many others, and many of them are using the water from the local aquifer, the local wetland, for their operations. So Google also has a Google data center. The problem is by the time that all these questions emerged, that data center was already in operation. And as a result, it's not that you can have a conversation about changing the infrastructure that's already in place. You can maybe get to negotiate with the company about what is the origin of that water. Can you implement in the next years a new cooling system? But it was just the timing was completely different. And in that case, that's why Resistencia Ambiental Quilicura wanted to do certain things. One, to negotiate with Google. The other was like next data centers, because it's a region that is concentrating a huge development of data centers, one of the biggest in Latin America, perhaps hand in hand with Querétaro in Mexico or Brazil, but it's just one of the biggest points. So the next data centers that will land in Quilicura eventually will not use a climatization system that will require water coming from the local aquifer and the wetland ecosystem. So that was different. So that's why negotiating both with the government and with the companies was fundamental, because we didn't have an environmental impact report there that was at the earliest stage of planning that we can stop the development, as it happened, for instance, with Meta in the Netherlands or with Cerrillos. So it was another stage. So in that sense, they differ a little bit. Like you can say that Cerrillos was more interested in a direct opposition and avoid the construction of the data centers. In Quilicura, the question is like, they are already there. We have to negotiate and eventually see how they can contribute to the local environment and economy.
I'm just curious then, since you didn't have any legal means to challenge it, why Google accepted to negotiate? Because they could have said, sorry, we have all the permits.
They didn't accept to negotiate. So after a lot of back and forth. I did travel to San Francisco to meet with representatives of Google, and we had good chats. They were invited. We organized a table. It was almost confirmed that everyone will be there, including the Ministry of Science and in Chile, local representatives of the government. We have an incredible setup in Quilicura, organized also by the local authorities of Quilicura, the communities, the activists. There were like different representatives from universities, from research, from the you name it. It was quite ambitious. No one from the Ministry of Science showed up. No one from the companies or corporations showed up. So it was very disappointing. At the same time, it was great to have a conversation with many of the other people who showed up. And that highlighted that perhaps we have to implement other tactics here. So that is when more like a media campaign took place, where we use all our possibilities and channels to voice the concerns. And finally, we got an appointment with the minister and her team. And we learned that I was in conversation with a person who was key for the process, Sebastian Diaz Howard Alman, who was an advisor for the minister. And he was in charge of developing the national plan for data centers. So what they told me is like, okay, sorry, we could not join the conversation, but we would like to invite you as one of the experts in the development of the plan. And I said, fine, only if you invite the communities who are protesting. So we are packed right now. And Sebastian, I don't know how he managed. He said, yes, okay, let's do that. So since from that moment onwards, the negotiation table that we imagined was a failure in some ways, but at the same time it wasn't, because finally we were able to have that table, not organized by us, but organized by the government. But similarly, it was the government, communities, academics, and the corporations and the companies involved. And Google also refused to be part of that group. So it was not that easy, because some of the bigger players, they said, well, if you want to negotiate, you negotiate one by one on one with us. We don't want to be part of the local association of data centers in Chile. We don't want to be part of these conversations. We just negotiate with you. And the government, as far as I know, said, no, this is the way we are not going to negotiate. You are either in or out.
I was wondering, because it was super interesting when you said that you're already part of a pact with the activist groups that you were involved in. So when you managed to make this conversation happen in the one room, was this conversation effective for the communities, or it just showed you that there's another way we should go about this?
It was indeed very helpful, because we had people like Jaime San Martin, that was the National Prize Award of Science in Chile. We had Kat Peña, who also has been working in these questions for a long time. We invited many people from different scientific associations. There were the representatives of Quilicura, and they were also telling us what they need, how difficult it is as a local government to face these corporations, how tiring it is, how confusing it is. Sometimes they don't know how to negotiate. Basically, what to ask for. We had an example of Google funding urban forest in Quilicura that was supposed to offset the emissions of the data center. And there was a misunderstanding, or I want to believe it as a misunderstanding, but we can also see a bit of malice in how it is done. The question is, they plant the trees, Google, but they didn't fund the maintenance of that infrastructure. So basically, it never materialized as a forest. It's just like a ruin of a possible project, but now no one takes care of it, because the government, local government, don't have the resources to maintain such a thing. They were under the impression that Google will take care of it, not only plant the trees. And Google said our agreement was just to plant the trees, provide the irrigation system, and we don't have anything to do. So that showed how it is very important to understand how to negotiate and how to make, good agreements with these companies, knowing what the consequences are in the long term. And that were part of the conversation that day. So help us all vocalize, share what were the concerns, the difficulties that each had to get information, to negotiate, how can we contribute. And I think it was very productive. So I think many things happened from that gathering. I see Paz Peña is now actively working in data centers as well. That was not the case before. Was more working in other digital rights. Many of the colleagues that we have at the university, Serena, D'Ambrosio, Nicolas Diaz, had also now curated the the Chilean pavilion in Venice that was also around data centers, having a lot of exposure. The communities in Quilicura have developed new campaigns, very effective campaigns to raise the voice. So many things were helpful, but not that actionable in relation to the companies themselves, but to self-organize.
I mean, that's a great outcome of that platform that you helped create there. But by the way, on the urban forest by Google, I'm reminded there are activities now near Amsterdam. There's a hyperscale development zone, more or less north of Amsterdam, where Microsoft and Google have hyperscale data centers and are aiming to expand. And they recently planted a few trees, and there was a lot of social media attention to those few trees that were planted there near the data centers, and sort of see a theme here emerging of small forest offsetting all the environmental damages of these infrastructures. But that's on a different note. One thing I wanted to ask before maybe moving on to sort of your assessment of the Chilean development plan. You said before there were different groups in different parts of the capital of Chile, each resisting data centers in their neighborhood. I'm wondering to what extent there was also sort of a divergence of interests, because I can imagine when this happens, when these developments happen, you might have citizens living right next door, mostly concerned about having a data center as a neighbor, for instance, because of light pollution or noise pollution or stuff like that. I can imagine there's environmental scientists who are more concerned at an abstract level. There are people who live of, I don't know, maybe tourism or fisheries or something related to a natural environment. I wonder, did that ever lead to tensions also? Because there are so many different and diverging interests. Or do you see the fact that there were so many diverging interests and the fact that they aligned at that meeting from different perspectives was actually helpful? And I'm also thinking here again about experiences here in the Netherlands where the sort of data center activism community is quite diverse and has different opinions and different perspectives.
Yeah, indeed. I have to say that, well, I tend to not to judge the reasons why anyone will support or go against these developments, because in many cases, it's a very complex construct and affecting their lives. So what I can say is the main concern for everyone was water, because also Chile is experiencing drought for a long time already. And the predictions are not very optimistic. So the concerns are like these infrastructures come, and we are left without water. That was across the board. The difference with other industries, including mining industry in Chile, is that many communities, many parts of the local populations are actually working in the mines, in related industries. That's not the case in data centers. We didn't meet anyone. No one knew anyone working in any of the data centers in Quilicura, for instance. So that was not something like, for instance, the other industries in Quilicura that possibly also have an impact in the wetland ecosystem, everyone knows, but they have a stronger relation with the community in other ways. Also economically, they are, people employed there. They have been inside. They know how they work. But that's not the case with these other industries. So there is a form of detachment that it doesn't feel it is part of the community in any way. They are just landing there, these very secure places. They don't know what is going on inside, but they know that it's affecting the environment. So that's different from, I would say, other industries. Obviously, there were many voices saying we are not against data centers. We like to have internet. This is our, digitization is part of the future of the country. We just want these companies they are very powerful companies and they should do it better. It's impossible that, how come Google, Meta, Amazon, these huge corporations with so much profit, they cannot do better? We don't believe that. So it was a form of accountability saying it's not that we don't want data centers. We want the best data center possible. That differs from other places I've been. And and also differs the type of engagement that communities have in this region. So Cerrillos might be a bit more belligerent in the sense of we don't want data center here. Whereas in Quilicura was like, well, maybe they can be here, but we have to negotiate the terms. And that showed in some of the negotiations we had and different strategies that these groups will have, which are both very important. And they all have reasons to work in different ways. And I think there was not necessarily a problem. Everyone will understand that everyone was trying to do the work on behalf of their own communities, and the socioeconomic and ecological contexts are slightly different.
Yeah, it's completely understandable. Maybe tying that to the outcome, the final national plan that is from 2024, I think, or 2025.
Yeah, it was at the end of 2024. Yeah.
So I see some of those tensions there in the final plan. I looked at it again, and on the one hand, it's about welcoming data centers to Chile. It's a sort of economic opportunity zone type of reasoning, and then at the same time, it expresses worry about the climate. It expresses worry about water and energy needs. And then there's this component of it contributing to the Chilean economy and to R&D and research, etc. What's your, if you want to take a position on that, judgment take on the final outcome? Are you happy or?
Yeah, I am. I know that many people will disagree with me. I am because to me, even though that is contradictory and has flaws, it's a very good start. And it shows that strategic planning is fundamental. And that's what we are lacking. So I thought it was very encouraging that Chile will draft such a plan and will do it also in collaboration and people like me or with the local population and the activists. So I'm optimistic. I was disappointed. Yes, I was disappointed because the wording, as you say, was very much leaning towards investment. And so it was not a surprise, but in a way, it hurts to see that still the ambition is we want you to come and here and invest, but we have to do it in a way that it doesn't break the system, it doesn't leave a population without water or energy, which is, basic, no? But funny enough, not many governments are doing that. There are many governments that I can name, including Mexico, that they are allowing investment, and so far they don't really care for what are the consequences, short or medium term. So in that sense, at least I have to recognize that there is a sort of planning. I'm annoyed because it's also pro-investment, but I was expected. But that also triggered quite a distrust, and disappointment for certain people involved. Like, well, this is, we are being greenwashed. Like, it might be, but at the same time, there are certain articles in the plan that are helpful. Mm-hmm. One, for the development of the plan, the continuous development and implementation, you have to keep on working with the local population and the people who were involved in the plan. That happened not as often as we wanted, but we had 2 meetings after the plan was presented, in which we were seated at the table with the minister, representatives from the companies, and the communities, the local population were also there, Cerrillos and Quilicura, etc. That is positive. There are also different tools that I might be ambivalent. One of them is mapping where the potential sites where data centers could be built. And I was a bit worried because that will involve gathering huge amount of information, socioeconomical, ecological, showing places for, there would be, let's say, fragile ecosystems. And those places will be no way that data centers cannot be built here. So what this map and this tool shows is that actually very few places in Chile where data centers could be located appropriately, which is good, that they at the same time contain development. What I was worried is that, also it's a tool for surveillance, and depending how it is used, you can disclose information that I didn't like the tool itself. But I appreciate the idea of a strategy, national strategy, where this infrastructure could be and how much and for how long and what do we need and how to plan for the possible dismantling. That type of thinking is present in the plan. That's already a lot compared to other regions. And obviously, there were agreements for green energy production and forms of accountability. So, in many ways, there were many of the questions that we brought to the table were represented. There was one, though, that we were very shocked that was not included. That was a question of transparency. We argued that we needed, to name it, a portal, a platform that will disclose consumption from data centers on a daily basis, so we can monitor and we can see what happens in peak moments of heat, for instance, etc. That didn't happen, and for different reasons. And I thought that was a missed opportunity because I think that platform is fundamental for everyone.
I still see that a strategic planning project like this is still a better prerequisite than strategic litigation, which is sort of counts for the consequences of a bad kind of planning. And to sort of bridge our conversations to the Spain context, in Aragon, where you recently formed a broad alliance of activist groups, neighborhood movements, university researchers, and the UNESCO chair in sustainable human development against the hyperscale expansion of Amazon company, the AWS. And this is the first lawsuit in Spain against hyperscale data center infrastructure. And together you chose to undergo a challenge specifically against the PIGA status, or the PIGA status that Amazon has, rather than going against the data center itself. So can you tell us a bit how it started and whose idea was this framing?
Yeah. So while I was working in Chile, obviously I'm from Spain, and it was inevitable to see that this development was also happening in Spain. So I got to know Aurora from this activist group, Tu no veas Río, that has been fundamental for raising, the voices of those who oppose the data center development, and has galvanized a lot of support in the last years. So I absolutely love Aurora. Is incredible. It's these people that you get their passion, and you will do anything that they tell you to do. So it's the same as Rodrigo Vallejos in Quilicura, Tania Rodriguez in Cerrillos. Aurora is also absolutely incredible. So through Aurora, I met also other people from Ecologistas en Acción, environmental association and groups in Spain who had a lot of experience in litigation, and people like Manu, Enol, Luis. So that is how we started. And also Ana Valdivia, who is a Spanish origin, but based in the UK, very well-known researcher on artificial intelligence. So we started to gather often and to see how to, first thing we did was to send allegations to the royal decree. So it was something even more serious than the plan in Chile, because the plan in Chile is very important framework, but it cannot be enforced in law. But in Spain, they were proposing a royal decree to regulate data centers. It was not that ambitious, I have to say, as we expected. So we made allegations. So we created this group to work together in those allegations. And as we were doing this, we realized that we have to do more. And there was the opportunity to take these legal frameworks that were allowing big corporations like Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Meta to be building huge amount of data centers in Spain without mostly paying taxes, without what we think is the proper environmental report, without a strategic planning. So there were so many developments happening at the same time, and no one was really looking into the cumulative effects of these infrastructures in the territory. And there were already many voices from the government, the central government, saying, well, if we will have as many data centers as the licenses that currently we are receiving for building data centers, the electric grid will be completely saturated. So we said, okay, we have to go against the law, the regional law, that is allowing Aragon, in this case, this region, to becoming one of the hubs of data centers in Europe without the proper assessment. And that's what we have done. So Ecologistas en Acción, to Nuestra Camirrio, Ana Valvidia, but it's the court case is being presented by Ecologistas en Acción. And we have some great lawyers in Barcelona. In fact, it was a process against the administration and the type of regulations in place, because they claim these are strategic investments. And we claim they are not a strategic investment because they are not bringing enough jobs. They are not bringing the benefits for the communities. And we can actually prove that in many different ways. Not only that, they affect resources, energy grids, they bring higher prices for consumers. They bring a lot of burden for the municipalities who have to deal with all these developments. So that's the case. But now, obviously, Amazon as an interested party has also is part of the process. So now, effectively, we are also litigating against Amazon.
What is the sort of the status of that plan that the government of Aragon has passed? Have they designated data centers as an essential economic activity, or is it more specific? Have they said this Amazon campus project is good for our economy? And are you then effectively having a debate about whether that's right or not? So this is turning into an economic debate. Are data centers good for Aragon or not?
The regulatory framework existed before data centers. It was a tool used to attract investment to a region that, in fact, has seen a lot of depopulation in the last years. That is true. So it has been a region that has been shrinking in terms of population for certain years. And the government, as many other governments, like regional government, developed these tools that we have seen at different scales in Europe that designating strategic industries and facilitating both the administrative work, the reorganization of land in terms of uses possible in certain lands, so they can transform a rural land into an industrial land very quickly. That otherwise will take, you can imagine, so much effort and processes. And also, mitigating somehow the type of taxes that they will have to pay. That under the idea that these industries will be indeed strategic for the region, bringing benefits across the board, like bringing more investment, bringing jobs, bringing benefits for the community. So it was not necessarily only created for data centers, but suddenly that was the law, the framework that was used to attract data centers. Now, we believe that data centers are different infrastructure and they don't fulfill some of the premises that this law has as been for strategic industries. It doesn't, and companies already admit that after a long, they were always naming the number of jobs that they were creating. Now they don't even do that because they know that is false, and they know. So there are many instances that this regulation doesn't fully, align with the reality of the data center industry. So that's what we are doing, just showing that it is not a strategic industry for the reasons they say it is. And therefore, all the benefits that these companies are having for installing their infrastructures should not be granted to them. They should go through other processes, and perhaps there should be a specific regulation for data centers that acknowledges their nature and the real impacts and the possible benefits, if anything. But right now, it should be something else, not what is being used.
What I find very interesting is that this is reminiscent of the debate in the Netherlands around data centers and their contribution to the economy. Is the impression that I'm having, and I'm wondering how that plays out in Aragon, is that governments don't necessarily have the evidentiary basis to claim that this sector has the economic benefits that are promised. So there's often a lack of good research on what the exact employment impacts will be. There's a lack of proper assessment of what the taxation situation will be when that industry settles vis-a-vis alternative scenarios. In other words, the governments claim that these are strategic or economically beneficial sectors of the economy, but that in fact, when you try to challenge that you pretty quickly find out that there might be less evidence underlying that than you would have hoped. Is that the case? I'm, as you can tell, already slightly biased in the way that I asked this question.
it is the case. And I understand, I mean, it's not that politicians are only, they don't do their work. But to be honest, anyone sees that at this very moment, the biggest investments that are happening around the world are around data centers, AI infrastructure, digital infrastructure. So, what are your opportunities? What are the possibilities for a politician in a region that needs investment to then dynamize the economy? Is so, in a way, if you receive the call of these companies and they explain how much they are going to invest, it sounds interesting. You want to believe, as investors, want to believe right now in the AI boom, but it should undergo a much more scrutiny because we can see that these investments many times fail to materialize in the way they are promised, and the benefits many times are less so, and the consequences are higher for the population. So we are seeing that, for instance, all the processes that are in place to accelerate the paperwork for data center actually create a bottleneck at the local level. The municipalities with, towns with 2,000 people, they have a very small team in the municipality to deal with these questions. They don't even have to have someone who is an expert in data centers. So the regional government gives all the, facilities, all the, easiness for data centers to do their work, and everything lands into these small municipalities that in their territory, they have 3 or 4 of those huge hyperscale infrastructures. That's crazy. So everyone is overwhelmed. These communities, these municipalities don't have the possibility to assess all the work. They have, imagine the reports coming from Meta, Amazon, Google at the same time. So it's actually totally collapsing the municipal systems. They cannot conduct their daily operations. They cannot think about the future of their places beyond data centers because that's collapsing completely their daily activities. That's a tragedy. And many times these municipalities will just sign because they cannot do it otherwise. They are just overwhelmed. And they know that if they say no and they fight, it takes so much time, resources, effort, and maybe the data center ends up in the next town and they will suffer the consequences nevertheless because the air pollution, the water and energy resources will be compromised. They are just neighbors. So this is very tragic. And that's why I've been collaborating with some of these municipalities as an advisor, because they need people to support them because they have other things to do. So in a way, me and Manuel and other people also from this group that we formed, we meet with the municipality and we are representing them in some of the conversations with the industry just to assess some of the claims they make in the environmental reports, to double check about the climatization systems, the way in which their effects are cumulative and they are measuring it in relation to then other developments happening at the same time, and so on and so forth, just to at least get the best out of the worst or create enough evidence for municipalities to take the decisions they want to take. And if that sin is taking them to court.
Just one thing that strikes me is that here in the Spanish situation, the central government is missing. Whereas we just discussed Chile and the role the central government took. I mean, the glass is half full, half empty, depending on where you stand, but at least they developed a plan and they were involved. The ministry was involved. Here, Spanish national government seems not to be involved.
Yeah, you see that Spain operates very, the regions have a lot of administrative power in the way they organize their politics and their investment. So in this case, many of these falls under regional governments. Of course, the national grid depends on the state. And there is already a tension because the central government, although I think is doing little, I will say, please do more. They have been voicing their concerns around the possibility of these developments disrupting the state grid, the electricity grid. So there are tensions. You see, there are tensions emerging between the different levels of government, municipal, regional, and state. So municipals say, okay, you invited all these people for dinner and we are paying the bill. The regional is trying to create investment for the region on, but at the same time annoying the state and the municipal level. The state level should do more, but also depends on like European Union regulations. And obviously I think they believe we need more regulation. The president few months ago announced also there will be, more regulation for underage children using social media. So I think there is a willingness to take these corporations accountable for their workings. But it's still, there's still very limited amount of things they can do within this construction sandwiched between the European Union, the geopolitical pressures, the regional government. And that's not to excuse them. I think the opportunity was precisely the royal decree and it was totally insufficient. And that was the reason why this movement also galvanized. And now we are taking Amazon and the regional government to court. So everyone can do better. And funny enough, many of us have offered that we will do it as we do pro bono advice and help. We have a great network, including all the people who is here right now, that we can help these governments to seek other options. I think they should take advantage of that in order to move forward.
Free help is always welcome, I would say, especially if it's good advice from people like you. Susanna, I think we wanted to talk a little bit about Marina's sort of positive vision for the future, and not in a depressed mode, but in a slightly more optimistic mode. And from my end, to summarize it, you're an architect, and so you design things. You think of how things could be, if I can summarize architecture in that simple way. If you were to decide on the futures of data centers, what would you imagine? Or would you say, I'd rather not see any at all whatsoever?
Yeah, it's funny because I keep on being optimistic amid all this chaos, but yeah. So I think, and I know that I have so many conversations with people who hates enormously what I'm going to say, but I think there should be public infrastructures. And when I say that, other people will say they are already public. There are millions of people using these platforms. Yeah, that doesn't mean public necessarily, I think in different regions of the world, still we believe in public infrastructures. I understand in many other places that's not the case, but I do. And I think it's such an important infrastructure that it should be public. And if I will be Jonas Stahl, who is a good friend, he will say should be collectivized, should be actually, not only public, but in the hands of the people directly, so that's the only way I believe that these infrastructures could change, because then the values around which they are designed will change. The ways in which cost and benefits operate in a spreadsheet of Google or Meta is very different of how they will operate in a local government or in a regional or state government, or at the level of the European Union. What are our priorities and how we should design this infrastructure for the public good?
I was wondering if you could make that specific with an example you like. So do you mean a public infrastructure as a library? Do you mean a public infrastructure as an internet exchange, a public infrastructure as some roads in certain countries? Like, do you have something like a model in mind, or are you open?
Well, I think first, I don't see there is one model that applies to all. And I think that's the problem, that we always believe that everything has to be scaled up, but not with the same characteristics. So the entire question to me is what I call these ecologies of data. And right now, data centers primarily are designed for hot data and very secure data. That's why they are designed as bunkers, very secure facilities that operate 24/7, regardless. So most of the infrastructures in a data centers are just there to ensure that whatever happens, these infrastructures will be running. I don't think that is needed for all types of data. So if you look at how libraries work or scientific laboratories, or even these huge, that's why I was visiting those spaces to understand how other industries, other places that accumulate huge amount of data, how they do it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there is different types of data. So it's hot, but there is also cold data, data that you don't need to retrieve immediately. That could be stored in different ways. It hasn't have to be readily available. That is not, I'm not saying something that weird. That operates with archives, but also many of these scientific laboratories have information on tape instead of readily available. That's common. They also delete information, to be honest. Even in the huge astronomical observatories, they don't save all the information they gather every night. So there is also a process of filtering and a process of deletion, which scientists hate because they would like to have all the information available, but it's not possible. Then you have private data, public, open source. So depending on this type of data, you also need different types of security. So if you need less security, and also different types of facilities. So yeah, if it's hot or cold data, but public and open source, we can think about a library as a model for sure. Why not? And then long lasting or very ephemeral data. So I think the combination of these different ecologies give different typologies of data centers. Some of them will still be bunkers or very similar to the systems we have now, and others will be completely different.
And what's the final question, maybe? What's the role of the principle of scarcity here? Because it seems that in many of the situations, data center operators are starting from the perspective of abundance. They're looking for abundant land. They're looking for abundant energy, abundant water, all of it to fuel whatever it is they are producing in their data centers. Is there a different logic by which they could operate? So you have your public data centers at the same time. There might still be a private market. How do you inject the notion of scarcity there? There's only so much energy, only so much renewable energy, only so much water, only so much land, only so much capital. Have you thought about how to introduce that into these debates?
Yes, although I tend not to talk about the scarcity, because when we mobilize the scarcity, unfortunately, the scarcity only comes to part of the population, and the other one, the 1%, keeps on living as if abundance will be the norm. So what I try to mobilize is other types of desires, like desire that has been co-opted by capitalism, I think can be also put forward in different ways to say, well, what is your real desire? Is that desires that we have of speed and connectivity and always availability, all that is a desire that we have, or is something that has been designed? How much our current desires in the way in which you use these platforms, our interactions with digital infrastructure, are really our desires, or we are captured by these designed desires and forms of compulsivity that are very much embedded in the design itself of these platforms. We know they are highly addictive. So if I think about my own desires and I think about how the cities work as an architect, someone who thinks about cities, they have different rhythms. Not everything is even this idea of New York, where I am right now, that the city never sleeps. Sorry, it sleeps. Obviously, there are places that are 24/7, but many are not. You go to the bank, you have to go at certain moments, even to the doctor. Then otherwise, you just have the emergency room. Schools operate at certain moments of the day. There are rhythms. There are like different forms of attunement. Cities work differently in different seasons. Sometimes we have to adapt to the use of resources because of possibility of drought. So why the digital infrastructure is always imagined from the point of view of always on, always fast, abundance? No. So it's not about frugality. It's just about how to attune, how to actually relate our needs, our rhythms, the rhythm of the planet and the city to the digital infrastructure. So instead of we adapt to the industry, it's how the industry should actually adapt. And that's what I believe, as many other people, is not saying something new, to be honest. Permacomputing, feminist servers, like indigenous clouds, many people has been thinking different ways in which these infrastructures could actually be more in synchrony. We work more symbiotic relation to availability of energy prices, our own bodily rhythms, etc. I don't think it's that even that radical. I think what is crazy is the other way around. So that will be my 5 cents.
Yeah, perhaps that sort of means that we as individuals have to get used to some sort of friction and maybe realize that this friction is actually good for us.
I was telling you when we last talked about this example of the Dutch Minister of Housing that was saying, well, we need to produce houses very quickly. We cannot now think about luxury. So she was recalling her time as a military, in the military, saying like, we can deploy troops and have infrastructures that work, but you have to, sometimes you cannot shower if you don't do it at the proper time. And sometimes you might not have all the energy enough to charge your phones. Yeah, okay. I thought it was interesting, but I was wondering why this type of measures have to be applied to the general population. And why scarcity and this idea of sacrifice for our comfort is only put as a burden to, the population and not the companies themselves. So let's turn it around. I like the ideas of your Minister of Housing. Let's take them for the digital industry, and instead of applying on how we use internet, let's use it on how data centers operate, and then we all follow.
We give them a coin and they say, you can use this much water.
You can
When the
use this
coin
much
is done.
water, pay from like 2 to 3, and good luck with that. Then you will start thinking, do you train your model today or no? Yeah. Do you do a image of Trump as a Jesus in AI, or you will use that infrastructure for something more interesting? Yeah, that's.
I think we have made a nice circle here. And I also like reflecting on our conversation, how we've traveled around the world from the Netherlands to Chile to Spain and now back to the US again. It's been a fascinating conversation, Marina, and I guess that if we wanted, we could have continued this conversation for many more hours, but afraid that doesn't work in this 24/7 economy. No one will listen to that. Thank you so much for really, really nice and in-depth conversation.
Thank you to you for your incredible work and for creating a space for these conversations as well. I very much appreciate it. Also, on behalf of everyone with whom I collaborate, they also appreciate this.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing to mention. You mentioned Aurora and so many other charismatic and committed individuals who make the difference in all of these different case studies that we discussed. In the Netherlands, we have these people too, like Fieke Jans, who's done spectacular work. And I think the world needs more of those.
Indeed. Yeah, if I'm here, it's because of them. So a big, big thank you to all of them.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Marina, for joining me today. And I wish you all the best of luck and especially strength in your future endeavors. This was Where the Cloud Touches the Ground. Thank you for listening to a special podcast series by Leitmotif. To follow all of our podcast series, visit our Paradigms channel on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Osha. For episode summaries, current activism projects, and link to work of our guest speakers, sign up for our newsletter through the link in the description.